The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, the Reverend Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. O God, lover of humanity, give us today your pardon and peace. Pardon the sins of our lips, the unkind words we may have spoken. Pardon the sins of our minds, the refusal to face facts. Lord, pardon the sins of our hearts, the pride that makes us forget to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Mighty God, place your peace within our senators, providing them with the certainty that your love can vanquish fear. And Lord, we continue to pray for the tornado recovery efforts. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., December 14, 2021, to the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Raphael G. Warnock, a senator from the state of Georgia, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Thank you. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Samantha D. Elliott of New Hampshire to be United States District Judge for the District of New Hampshire.
Judicial nominee. Now today, Mr. President.
The majority leader is recognized.
Now today, Mr. President, the Senate will vote to advance at least one more Biden judicial nominee. We'll move forward on our annual defense bill. We'll vote on the motion to proceed on legislation to raise the debt ceiling, all hopefully before we start the afternoon. It's a busy day for the Senate, so let me break down each of these items in some detail. On the legislative front, later this morning, the Senate will vote to invoke cloture on the annual defense bill, negotiated on a bicameral, bipartisan basis. For over 60 years, the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, has passed without fail on a mostly bipartisan basis. So I thank all of my colleagues for working in good faith to getting this defense bill done. The Senate will then turn to the critical matter of addressing the debt limit in order to avoid a first-ever default on our sovereign debt. Last week, Democrats and Republicans came together to pass legislation setting up a fast-track process for addressing the debt limit. Today, we're going to complete that process, and it will come in two steps. First, as I said, we'll vote on the motion to proceed, followed by a vote on final passage later today. Thanks to last week's agreement between Democrats and Republicans, today's motion to proceed will be set at a majority threshold. Once we're on the bill, no amendments will be in order, debate will be limited to 10 hours, and we hope to yield back debate time on our side to keep this progress moving. The resolution we will vote on will provide for raising of the debt limit to a level commensurate with funding necessary to get into 2023. As I have said repeatedly, this is about paying debt accumulated by both parties. So I'm pleased Republicans and Democrats came together to facilitate a process that has made addressing the debt ceiling possible. I want to thank the Republican leader and all my Republican colleagues who reached out across the aisle in good faith to bring us to this point. No brinksmanship, no default on the debt, no risk of another recession. Responsible governing has won on this exceedingly important issue. The American people can breathe easy and rest assured there will not be a default. So once again, I thank the Republican leader and my Republican colleagues who voted with us to address this issue. The Senate can be done with this matter before the end of the day, crossing another major item off of our December to-do list. Off the floor, Democrats continue working to put the Senate in a position to act on President Biden's Build Back Better Act, along with the timeline I've set out for our caucus. This week, bipartisan birdbath meetings with the parliamentarian will continue, and I thank my colleagues, the parliamentarian, and her team for working through this important and difficult process. The President will also continue his conversations with our caucus as we hash out the final details of the legislation. Build Back Better is moving forward, and I thank all of my colleagues and the President for their diligence and their commitment to get this done. On judges and nominations, in addition to our legislative agenda, the Senate will also work today and the rest of the week on confirming more of President Biden's nominees to serve on the federal bench. First, we will hold a vote this morning to proceed on the nomination of Samantha Elliott to serve as a district judge for the District of New Hampshire. And as soon as today, we also hope to vote on the confirmation of Jennifer Sung of Oregon, nominated to sit on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. The Senate invoked cloture on Ms. Sung at the end of last week, and I want to say a few words in support of this remarkable nominee. Throughout her career, Ms. Sung has proven herself to be an exceptional and impartial adjudicator, a valiant advocate for working Americans, and I'm confident she'll be an excellent judge who adds to the personal and professional diversity of the Ninth Circuit. A graduate of Oberlin and Yale Law School, Ms. Sung's first experience with the Ninth Circuit came while she served as a clerk for Judge Betty Fletcher, before embarking on a career in private practice focused on employment and on labor law. For over a decade, she regularly represented low-income workers, minority workers, underserved communities in disputes against their employers. As a member of the Oregon Employment Relations Board, she struck a difficult balance between protecting the rights of working Americans while applying the law without prejudice, the key ingredients, Mr. President, for any successful federal judge. If confirmed, Ms. Sung would be one of the very few Asian Americans to sit on the federal judiciary. Along with Ms. Elliott, she would be the 31st judge that the Senate Democratic majority has confirmed this year, the most under any president's first year in decades. And we are doing it with outstanding, impartial, and diverse nominees. And we're going to keep working in the months ahead. Today, Article III judges are still overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, and overwhelmingly from big law firms or prosecutorial backgrounds. Many of these individuals have served admirably on the bench. But we hope the trailblazers of today can be closer to the norm of tomorrow. We want our courts to include more women, more diverse candidates, both demographically and professionally, and more judges who come from unique walks of life. That is how we can strengthen Americans' trust in an independent and impartial judiciary, so important to the vitality of our democracy. Now on the COVID moment of silence. This evening, I will join the Speaker and other congressional leaders on the Capitol steps to mark a dreaded and sorrowful milestone. 800,000 Americans, 800,000, have now lost their lives to the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll hold a moment of silence in their memory. As Americans come together for the holidays, as we take stock of the long road we've taken this year, many of us carry in our hearts an unresolvable contradiction. Gratitude for the progress we've made, but grief for the loss we've endured along the way. Thanks to vaccines, tens of thousands of deaths, maybe even hundreds of thousands, have been thankfully prevented. Across the country, Americans are returning to work and once again meeting at bars, restaurants, and concerts. Our country is far better off today than we were a year ago. But on this day, we'll remember that 800,000 loved ones did not make it this far. A lost father or grandfather, mother or grandmother, a friend, a familiar face in the neighborhood. All of us know someone whom this disease has taken away. And of course, we are not out of the woods yet. As the Omicron variant makes its way across the country, I urge my fellow New Yorkers and all my fellow Americans to get vaccinated and boosted as soon as possible if eligible. Vaccines remain the best, the very best way to bring this disease to an end. I hope the milestone we observe today is the final one in our fight against this awful disease. With vaccines, we can rid ourselves of COVID and avoid adding to the awful sum that we've reached this week. As for those we have lost today we remember them, we hold them close to our hearts, and we commit to doing our part to bring this pandemic to an end. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Entirely new challenges. Kentucky is working to recover from the deadly storms and tornadoes. Each day brings entirely new challenges. Tens of thousands are still dealing with water, gas, or power outages. Families are in shock and grief over the loss of loved ones. Rebuilding the areas of Kentucky leveled by this storm will take months, if not years, to complete. Amid this pain, though, bright lights of hope shine through. In the face of tragedy, Kentuckians are still as strong and as generous as we've always been. Yesterday, I spoke with Taylor County Judge Executive. He told me that 70 families in his county had lost their homes in the storm. Emergency responders made shelters available, but folks were quickly taken in by family, friends, or neighbors. Just the kind of people we have in Kentucky. In Mayfield, residents are already beginning to rebuild only days after the storm leveled full city blocks. Churches hosted Sunday services this past weekend. Locals brought their chainsaws and cleared debris from the city's roads. People from nearby counties and states have literally flooded in to help. One man, Jimmy Finch, has struck a chord with America's hearts all across the country. He had no connections to Mayfield whatsoever. He's from Clarksville, Tennessee. But after the disaster, he borrowed a big meat smoker, got into his car, made the hour-and-a-half journey in the dead of night, and started serving up food the next morning. This fellow from Tennessee came up to Kentucky and brought a whole bunch of food. On Sunday morning, for hours, he fed chicken, hot links, and burgers to hungry residents who had been without heat or power for days. Western Kentucky's radio and TV stations have kept operating throughout this crisis, delivering vital information, even amid roving power outages. State parks opened their doors to residents who lost their homes. Businesses, individuals, and charities have been generous with food, water, and shelter. Kentucky's first responders are working hand in hand with FEMA to provide coordinated relief. Doctors, nurses, firefighters, and law enforcement officers are working literally through the night. Utility workers are making a Herculean effort to restore power and water. Hundreds of Kentucky National Guardsmen have deployed to Western Kentucky to offer their assistance. And at Fort Campbell, the federal government has provided a critical lifeline of support, 61 generators, 74,000 meals, 135,000 liters of water, thousands of cots and blankets, all supplied by Fort Campbell. I'm in close contact with Governor Beshear, our federal agencies, and local leaders. My staff and I have been in frequent touch with the White House. Kentucky will come back from this bigger and better than ever before. I'll make sure the Senate provides all the assistance we can to make sure that's a reality. Now, Mr. President, on a totally different matter, Washington Democrats' printing, borrowing, and spending addiction is directly hurting American families. 2/3 of the American people, a supermajority, are worried about inflation. About half the middle class and 70% of low-income families say soaring prices have personally hurt their household. And it isn't getting better, like the Biden administration promised it would. It's actually getting worse. Last Friday, the Labor Department released a jaw-dropping report. The Consumer Price Index has shot up 6.8% over the past year, 6.8% inflation. The worst inflation, listen to this, the worst inflation in 40 years. Now, it's true that the average American worker has gotten a pay increase since 2020, but rising prices have more than wiped that totally out. We have a remarkable situation where American workers are earning raises, but their bigger paychecks buy their families even less than what their smaller paychecks bought before the Democrats took power. The net effect is a nearly 2% pay cut for the average American. Now, our citizens do know what's happening. 67% of the country says Washington needs to cut back on spending and printing money. Let me say that again. 67% of the country says Washington needs to cut back on spending and printing money. But here in Washington, leading Democrats want to plow ahead and double down on the reckless taxing and spending spree that got us here. They want to respond to this stunning inflation report by printing, borrowing, and spending trillions upon trillions more on new entitlements and far-left programs. And if that weren't bad enough, on Friday, a new report showed their socialist shopping spree could cost the country trillions more than Democrats are willing to admit. You see, as one of our Democratic colleagues explained last month, his party's bill is packed full of shell games and budget gimmicks. Shell games and budget gimmicks. For example, Their bill pretends that major new entitlements would simply expire after a few years. Of course, that never happens. As a wise man once said, nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program. And Democrats aren't even pretending they think the spending would stop. They're boasting about a permanent transformation. The fake expiration dates are just an accounting trick so the price tag looks artificially low. And last Friday, the Congressional Budget Office announced that if we acknowledge the permanent entitlements would be permanent, in other words, tell the truth, their bill would actually cost $4.9 trillion in the first decade alone. That is the truth of the situation. It would explode the deficit by $3 trillion in that same 10-year period. Democrats are trying to reassure their alarmed members that they'd find new ways to offset future extensions. But let's think about it. They've just spent months shoveling every possible pay-for into this existing bill. They already burned through huge permanent tax hikes just to partially offset the bill with the gimmicks. Extending these programs further would either explode our national debt or it would take even further trillions and even further gigantic tax hikes that Democrats are simply unwilling to specify. So which is it? Historic deficits or trillions more in secret tax hikes? The right answer for the country is neither. Later today, every Senate Democrat is going to vote on party lines to raise our nation's debt limit by trillions of dollars. If they jam through another reckless taxing and spending spree, this massive debt increase will just be the beginning. More printing and borrowing to set up more reckless spending, to cause more inflation, to hurt working families even more. What the American people need is a break. Now, on one final matter, for months while our colleagues have been writing their reckless taxing and spending spree behind closed doors, the Democratic majority let the National Defense Authorization Act sit in limbo. This week, 4.5 months after it was cleared by the Armed Services Committee, the Senate should finally finish this legislation. Unfortunately, those who mean America harm haven't been waiting around for us to act. Threats to our national security are grave and getting graver. Since the Biden administration's disastrous retreat from Afghanistan, according to our top commander in the region, the U.S. military has but a small fraction of the actionable intelligence they had before the coalition withdrew. But the predictable, avoidable resurgence of terrorist networks, of course, has continued apace. We also know that more American citizens and permanent residents remain stranded under Taliban rule than the Biden administration is willing to admit. Meanwhile, the threat of further Russian aggression toward Ukraine is testing whether this White House and our allies in Europe will avoid misguided half measures to deter and defend against grave and growing threats. So, at the risk of stating the obvious, the United States needs to follow through with promises of urgent, substantive assistance to Ukraine and encourage other NATO allies to do the same thing. This should not be controversial. Only in the warped world of Kremlin propaganda is giving Ukraine the means to defend itself considered provocative. These real threats to national security, and others too numerous to name, should serve as a reminder of the need for America to lead by example and commit to modernizing our own military capabilities, which in turn means taking the National Defense Authorization Act seriously. So, I'm glad the Senate is finally set to vote on this crucial legislation. While the process has been imperfect, I'm glad that bipartisan work has produced a bill that authorizes an increase in top-line funding for our national defense. After months of delay, our colleagues have an opportunity to begin showing that America is serious about keeping pace with adversaries like Russia, who've spent literally decades modernizing their militaries with a singular focus on countering our military advantage. We have an opportunity to pay more than just lip service to competition with China. We have an opportunity to lay a foundation that we ought to follow through with robust and full-year defense appropriations. I would encourage all senators to advance this legislation today.
Mr. Terrible reminder. Mr. President,
The Majority Whip.
Mr. President, the monstrous chain of tornadoes and violent storms that rampaged across Illinois and 5 other states last Friday is a terrible reminder in America that we are all one people. The killer storms didn't stop at state lines. They didn't discriminate based on skin color, creed, political party, or age. Among the more than 90 victims that we know of at this moment, the eldest was 86 years old. The youngest, sadly, was a tiny baby, just 5 months old. Even as people in my state of Illinois grieve for victims in our state, we also mourn for and with all those who died and are suffering in nearby states: Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Missouri, and especially our neighbor to the south, Kentucky. Senator McConnell has spoken, and we've all seen reports of the staggering destruction in Mayfield, Kentucky, and other communities. I want to say a few words about the destruction that was wreaked in my own state, and also about the tremendous outpouring of compassion and community. The National Weather Service tells us more than 30 tornadoes tore through 6 states last Friday night. The most destructive may go down as the longest continuous tornado in the history of the United States. That tornado appears to have remained on the ground for 4 hours, traveling 290 miles across 4 states, pulverizing everything in its path. From Kentucky, there are reports of objects being lifted 30,000 feet in the air by the force of the tornado. Treasured family photos were found 100 miles away. Sadly, at least 80 people have lost their lives in Kentucky. In Illinois, we have also suffered staggering losses. 4 tornadoes tore across our state between 7:30 and 10 o'clock last Friday. The greatest devastation was in Edwardsville, Illinois, in Madison County, where a powerful tornado with winds up to 155 miles an hour peeled the roof off a massive Amazon distribution facility about 9 o'clock. I know that facility, I've been there. Massive concrete walls 11 inches thick and 40 feet high caved in, trapping employees who were working to fill Christmas and holiday orders. Fire and rescue crews from at least 20 communities rushed to the scene. More than 45 workers managed to escape from that mountain of rubble, but 6 workers died when the warehouse collapsed. The oldest was 62, the youngest was 26. 30 more workers were hurt, one still hospitalized with critical injuries. I know I speak for millions of Americans when I say that our hearts go out to all those who perished in Friday's tornadoes and to those they left behind. I thank President Biden for responding quickly. Yesterday, our governor, J.B. Pritzker, requested emergency declaration, and of course, we join him in that request. The president issued the emergency order just a few hours after that request. This assistance will help our state immediately, but there's more to do. Thanks to the Red Cross and so many volunteers, local residents, and communities across Illinois for pitching in to help the victims. Supplementing that fine work are volunteers who have come to help in any way they can. It was ironic that last week I had a coffee for a man named Jose Andres. Jose Andres is well known by many across the country for his extraordinary efforts to feed hungry people. Last Tuesday, he spoke to us and a few members of our caucus about his nonprofit organization, the World Central Kitchen. They've come to the rescue of people in need in Puerto Rico and Haiti and all across the United States. Today, World Central Kitchen is on the ground in Mayville, Kentucky, where the tornado struck last Friday, providing hot food to the victims. It's a time when America, a divided nation, actually sees our nation coming together. The tornadoes didn't distinguish between red states and blue states, between Trump supporters and Biden supporters. And it's my great hope that the Senate will also put aside its politics for a few moments and stand together to help the victims. On a related matter, Mr. President, while we cannot say that last week's killer tornadoes were directly related to climate change, there's no doubt among scientists that climate change is making the world's weather patterns more volatile and destructive. How many times in the past year have members of the Senate come to the floor to respond to a once-in-a-century heat wave, a once-in-a-century storm that has hit their home state? I'll just say for tornadoes, you can't be a kid growing up in the Midwest as I was and not know about tornadoes. How many times in the middle of the summer we were rousted out of our bed as the sirens went off and Mom would take us down to the basement, a safe place until the storm would blow over. That was a summer phenomenon. I just have to remind you, we just went through a December tornado in that same area, unheard of in years gone by. Over the summer, the Pacific Northwest burned in the worst heat wave on record. Droughts in western states, polar vortex knocking Texas power grid offline. Each of these deadly and disastrous weather events are related to the next. And it's a fair warning to all of us that what's happening to the climate in the United States is happening around the world. Just yesterday, scientists warned that a glacier the size of Florida is at risk of splitting apart in the next few years, causing catastrophic rise in sea levels that could threaten millions of people living in coastal areas. When we talk about Build Back Better, the reconciliation bill, and that part of the bill that is focused on environmental resilience, being ready to protect ourselves and to bounce back if necessary when extreme weather hits, it's the topic in this morning's newspaper, and it'll be in tomorrow's as well. We ought to be coming together and finally put aside our political differences and realize that climate change is a threat to us now and an even greater threat to our children and grandchildren. Last week, I received a letter from one of the small business owners in our area, Dr. Dane Glick. A few years ago, he started a company called Straight Up Solar, developing solar energy systems for homes and businesses in my state of Illinois and Missouri. He wrote and he said, solar is a job creator. The long-term tax incentives in the Build Back Better Act for solar, storage, and domestic manufacturing will put us on a path to decarbonize the electric grid, reach the President's 2035 clean energy target, and create hundreds of thousands of quality career opportunities in every community. Today, Dr. Glick employs 100 people throughout the Midwest, but with investments in the Build Back Better Act, the reconciliation bill, he's going to expand operation and hire more workers. Let's give him the incentive that he needs. I heard the senator from Kentucky, the Republican leader, come to the floor, and once again, he is critical of this whole effort. I wish he would stop and reflect on the fact that our incentives to move in the right direction on the environment really are an important part of the conversation we should have after the devastation last Friday in his state and mine and across the Midwest. It's time to transform our environmental crisis into an economic catalyst. Mr. President, I would also like to put a statement in the record at a separate location with unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Mr. President, turns out it's an anniversary, just this month. You see, in 1921, 100 years ago, a Canadian scientist named Frederick Banting discovered insulin. He sold the patent for this discovery to the University of Toronto for $1. He declared that this life-saving drug didn't belong to him, quote, "It belongs to the world." He wasn't the only unselfish scientist I can remember. I remember as a kid our fear of polio, and along came Dr. Jonas Salk, bless his soul, and discovered the discovered the vaccine that we needed to protect ourselves. There was no great political debate. People weren't threatening lawsuits. My mom and dad said, line up and roll up your sleeve, kid. We're going to do what needs to be done to protect you from polio. Dr. Jonas Salk gave away the patent to that drug as well. It was a different era, perhaps, when insulin was discovered or the polio vaccine. But we should reflect on the state of play today of that drug insulin. 100 years later, there are 8.4 million diabetics in the United States who rely on insulin. They have to pay, many of them, an exorbitant amount of money for a drug that supposedly belongs to them, according to its discoverer. As the cost of insulin has risen, average list prices increased 40% for insulin between 2014 and 2018. I'm quoting from an article in today's USA Today by Katie Waddell. Patients and their families are shelling out hundreds of dollars, even if they have good insurance. Ron Regalado is the father of a teen with type 1 diabetes. Do you know what he calls the insulin pricing system? Legal extortion. This article tells a story of what he went through. He'd never heard of a pharmacy benefit manager before 2 years ago, but it was 2 years ago that his son, Matt, then 14 years old, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And Mr. Regalado got a crash course in insulin pricing in America today. His first trip to the pharmacy when his son was released from the hospital came with a $1,000 price tag for all the testing supplies and insulin he'd never purchased before. The next month, when all he had to do was buy more insulin, the price was still north of $400 after insurance. This single dad of two said he thought he had good insurance until he found himself having to redo his entire household budget to afford the insulin to keep his son alive. I thought, how do people do this, he said. He's a resident of Tacoma, Nebraska. He started making calls to his insurance company, the pharmacy and doctors, trying to figure out a way to lower his out-of-pocket expenses for the insulin that his son needed to survive. Then he called his congressman. Congressman Jeff Fortenberry, a Republican of Nebraska, said in July, quote, "The harsh reality is that the cost of insulin is artificially high and ever escalating." He's introduced a bill at capping the prices. They call it Matt's Act, after Mr. Regalado's son. Matt's Act would make insulin prices fair for everyone by capping the price at $60 a vial and $20 a vial for those on insurance. What a dramatic difference that would make for the Regalado family in Nebraska. Instead of $400, $20. The reason I raise that is the provision in law that we are trying to enact is in the same bill that the Republican leader just came to the floor and told us America cannot afford. The tax increases in that bill, and there will be tax increases, will only apply to people making over $400,000 a year. And yet the Republican leader comes to the floor and talks about this terrible idea of raising taxes. So let's step back and measure the difference here. Should Mr. Regalado, a single dad, father of two, with a 14-year-old son who needs insulin to live, be paying $400 a month or $20 a month for the insulin, the life-saving insulin? And to make up the difference, is it unfair to ask someone making over $400,000 a year to pay more in taxes? You be the judge. I don't even think it's a close call. What we need to do is to get down to business. I don't know that there'll be a single Republican voting to support this effort to reduce the cost of insulin for 8 million diabetics. That's just the way politics works in this chamber, I'm afraid. But I do hope that the 8 million families who have a diabetic son or daughter, father or mother, will step up and speak up in the next few days, because we have a chance to bring this measure to the floor this year, a measure which will affect many different areas of the law, but specifically the cost of insulin for American families. If those 8 million families will stand up and speak up and say to members of the United States Senate, enough, you've negotiated enough, close the deal, do something that will be helpful to our families, just maybe that can make a difference. Maybe the endless negotiations that have gone on for month after month after month will finally come to an end. Now's the time to get it done. We have work to do in the Senate in clearing the bill for final passage, but I think we're on the track to get that done. What we need to have is a groundswell of support from across America. When you take a look at the other provisions in the bill, helping working families to pay for daycare, for goodness sakes, there's hardly a family around, unless they're very wealthy, that isn't concerned about the cost and quality of daycare available. We have a provision in this bill, the same bill that Senator McConnell spoke against just a few minutes ago, to help families pay for daycare. Is it important to these families? Well, it's important to my family. I visited with my granddaughter over the weekend, and I'm sure there are many people in my situation with grandchildren who look at those kids and realize they should be in a safe, nurturing, affordable environment every single day, so mom and dad don't have to think twice. Is it important to have a provision in the law which said we're going to provide home health care services to elderly members of our family or disabled members of our family? I'll tell you this, the elderly folks that I speak to, the senior citizens, want to stay independent as long as possible, and they want to stay home as long as possible. If we can help them stay home and be independent, why wouldn't we do it? If it means a tax increase for people making over $400,000 a year, so be it. Sign me up for that increase. That's the sort of thing I think we do in America. Those who are well off pay a little bit more in taxes, so those who are struggling can get a helping hand. So when the Republicans come to the floor and tell us how terrible this bill is, we'll tell it to 8 million families in America with someone who needs insulin to stay alive each month. Tell it to the millions of families with kids who want to make sure they have peace of mind that these kids are being taken care of while they go to work. Tell them to the families with elderly parents or people who are disabled in their household who need a helping hand to be able to stay home and have quality health care. All of these things are addressed in this bill. It is important that we pass it, and I hope we do it soon, but we need to hear from America to create the momentum to get that job done. Mr. President, I ask that this entire article from the USA Today on insulin be placed in the record.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Republican whip.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that I be able to complete my remarks prior to the vote.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the latest inflation numbers came out Friday, and the news was not good. Inflation is currently at the highest level in nearly 40 years. 40 years. The last time inflation was this bad, E.T. and Rocky III were in theaters, and the Green Bay Packers were being coached by Bart Starr. Mr. President, high inflation is taking a major toll on American families. Gas prices that are 7-year high. The price of used cars and trucks is up 31%. 31%, Mr. President. Propane, kerosene, and firewood are up 34%. Food prices have increased significantly. Ground beef is up 14%. Apples up 7.4%. Pork is up 17%. Eggs, 8%. Baby food is up 6.7%. Bacon and related products are up 21%. And Mr. President, the list continues. Rent prices are up. Utility prices are up. Furniture prices are up. And on and on. Inflation is so bad that despite wage growth this year, Americans have seen a de facto pay cut, with real average hourly earnings down 1.9% this year. Mr. President, inflation is what happens when you have too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. And a big reason for our current inflation situation is Democrats' decision to pour a lot of unnecessary government money into the economy earlier this year, despite, I might add, being warned that their partisan $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan spending spree could stoke inflation. And you don't have to take my word for it. Here's what former Obama economic advisor Jason Furman had to say recently when discussing our inflation problem. And I quote, "The original sin was an oversized American Rescue Plan. It contributed to both higher output but also higher prices, end quote. That quote from Mr. Furman appeared in a New York Times article that also noted, and I quote, "But some economists, including veterans of previous Democratic administrations, say much of Mr. Biden's inflation struggle is self-inflicted." Lawrence H. Summers is one of those who say the stimulus bill that the president signed in March gave too much of a boost to consumer spending. Mr. Summers, who served in the Obama and Clinton administration, says inflation now risks spiraling out of control, and other Democratic economists agree there are risks, end quote. Again, that, Mr. President, from the New York Times. Mr. President, inflation is spiraling out of control. And Democrats are preparing to throw more fuel on the fire. That's right. Democrats are preparing to double down on the strategy that helped get us in this mess in the first place and pass yet another massive government spending bill. I'm not sure whether Democrats simply don't care about the inflation situation facing American families or whether they're operating under the delusion that they can somehow pass another major government spending bill without serious consequences for the economy. Regardless, there's no question that pouring another $1.75 trillion in government money into the economy would likely make our inflation crisis even worse than it is today. Now, Mr. President, I say $1.75 trillion because that's what Democrats have been selling is the price tag for their so-called Build Back Better plan. But as we learned on Friday of last week from the Congressional Budget Office's latest analysis, Democrats' spending spree would far exceed $1.75 trillion. When you take away the shell games and budget gimmicks, Democrats' spending spree would cost almost $5 trillion. $5 trillion. And of course, the tax hikes in the Democrats' plan, as large as they are, wouldn't even come close to funding that amount. Democrats' Build Back Better proposal, if implemented over 10 years as they plan, would add an eye-popping $3 trillion to our national debt. It turns out that Build Back Better is more like Build Back Bankrupt. Mr. President, Democrats have attempted to disguise the true cost of their Build Back Bankrupt plan by strategically sunsetting various provisions before the end of the bill's 10-year budget window. Of course, Democrats have never had any intention of actually sunsetting these provisions. But by claiming that they are going to sunset these measures, they have been able to sort of disguise the fact that their spending spree would actually cost nearly $5 trillion. That's the Congressional Budget Office, not me. The Congressional Budget Office last Friday said, if extended, a 10-year window, this bill would cost $5 trillion. Now, Democrats are implicitly admitting that they plan to extend these programs, but they are saying that people shouldn't worry that the cost of these extensions will be offset. Well, I'd like to know just how exactly they plan to do that. With massive new tax hikes on top of the tax hikes they've already included in their bill, just how many tax hikes do Democrats think our economy can handle? And if Democrats had a plan for future offsets, why didn't they include those offsets in their bill in the first place, along with an honest accounting of the length of their programs? Is it because they thought that the American people would balk if they knew the true cost of the bill? That they might not be crazy about the idea of a bill that would cost them $5 trillion. Mr. President, I'm hard-pressed to think of anything more irresponsible than for Democrats to pass their Build Back Better or their Build Back Bankrupt measure right now. Inflation is soaring, as I've just pointed out, and there's no clear end in sight. Even the Federal Reserve is now acknowledging this isn't transitory. They've removed that word from their description. We're emerging from a pandemic that required a lot of government expenditure, and a corresponding increase in our debt. And we have no idea what government money might be needed down the road. Passing a $5 trillion spending spree that would add $3 trillion to our national debt is the very last thing that we should be doing. I hope that at least some of my Democrat colleagues will think better of their spending plans before the American people are forced to discover just what building back bankrupt is really like. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Executive Counter Number 576, Samantha D. Elliott of New Hampshire, to be United States District Judge for the District of New Hampshire, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Samantha D. Elliott of New Hampshire to be the United States District Judge for the District of New Hampshire shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Round. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Brown, Cardin, Collins, Durbin, Padilla, Peters, Romney, Sanders, Shaheen, Smith, Tester, Warnock. Senators voting in the negative: Cotton, Hyde-Smith, Thune. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Paul, no. No. Ms. Cortez, no.
Measure, the yeas are 59, nays are 40. The will now report the motion to invoke. On this measure, the yeas are 59, nays are 40. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will now report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to concur in the House Amendment to S. 1605, a bill to designate the National Post Memorial, and so forth, and for other purposes.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to concur in the House Amendment to S. 1605, an act to designate the National Pulse Memorial located at 1912 South Orange Avenue in Orlando, Florida, and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Burr, Carper, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Ernst, Graham, Grassley, Hyde Smith, Inhofe, Kane, Kelly, Kennedy, Langford, Leahy, Manchin, Murkowski, Peters, Risch, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Tillis, Warner, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Lee, Padilla, Paul, and Portman. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Kramer, Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye.
Chairman, are we going tonight now?
Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Menendez, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. McConnell, Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 86, the nays are 13. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. President. Oh,
Cloture having been invoked, the Senate will resume legislative session to resume consideration of the House message to accompany S. 1605, which the clerk will report.
Resolved that the bill from the Senate S. 1605, entitled An Act to Designate the National Pulse Memorial located at 1912 South Orange Avenue in Orlando, Florida, and for other purposes, do pass with an amendment.
The motion to refer and the amendments pending thereto fall.
Mr. President, I move
The Majority
to
Leader.
I move to proceed to calendar 184, SJ Reg 33.
Clerk will report the motion.
Calendar number 184, SJ Res 33, joint resolution relating to increasing the debt limit.
Questions on the motion?
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr. Thank you. did. Thank you very much. Oh.
I think you have a sick person at the door who wants to vote.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll get right to them. Here, what do you know? Yeah, I'll get it right. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. I got you both. Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Cantwell, Cardin, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, King, Leahy, Lujan, Menendez, Murray, Ossoff, Reed, Sanders, Schumer, Sinema, Tester, Warren, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Graham, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Lee, Marshall, Moran, Risch, Rounds, Rubio, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Blunt, no. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Romney, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Crapo, no. I did, thank you. Mr. Tuberville, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Ms. Collins, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye.
Comes the Congresswoman. How are you, Madam Congresswoman? Nice to see you. Jonathan Greenblatt, of course, from the ADL. Nice to see you. And Councilmember Charles Allen, Joanne Lidgate from States United. Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today. Before I get started with the substance of my remarks, I'm proud to introduce you to several people who've inspired why we are here today and lent substantial assistance to the historic suit that we filed in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. First, the Honorable Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who will speak after me. Next will be the Honorable Charles Allen, Ward 6 Council member that covers this Capitol Hill area and other areas of the District of Columbia. He's also the chair of the D.C. City Council Judiciary Committee. Joanne Lidgate is the executive director of States United Democracy Center, a bipartisan organization that works to ensure access to voting for all and works against violence and extremism. Of course, last but not least is Jonathan Greenblatt. He's the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, the leading organization in the fight against hate that works tirelessly to advocate for justice and fair treatment for all. I also want to thank our co-counsel in the case who've provided excellent pro bono assistance, and those are lawyers from two firms, Deckert LLP and Paul Weiss Rifkin Wharton and Garrison, two of the world's greatest law firms who have so generously and expertly assisted us in this matter. Ladies and gentlemen, behind us, of course, is the United States Capitol, the recognized symbol of democratic government. This building has stood since 1800, and it is where Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our country's longest-serving elected president's words are inscribed. And here's what they say: "We must remember that any oppression, any injustice, any hatred is a wedge designed to attack our civilization." Allow me now to take us back to another tragic day that befell our country, September 11, 2001. On this day, the United States weathered a terrorist attack covertly orchestrated from beyond our country's borders, one that also aimed to take down our capital if it wasn't for the heroes on Flight 93. Our country responded by declaring war on terrorism in what became our country's longest armed conflict. Nearly a year ago, on January 6, 2021, our country faced a very different but familiar enemy, inflamed by a sitting president and other elected officials. Fellow Americans dressed in military fatigues and wearing red, white, and blue were armed with weapons and materials that shockingly permitted them to construct a wooden gallows used to execute someone by hanging on the grounds of our hallowed Capitol. Like the planes that attacked the Pentagon and the World Trade Center and crashed in the fields of Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the images of that shameful and contemptible day can never be erased. It was like 9/11, a planned terrorist attack, but this time our own citizens were hell-bent on destroying the freedoms and ideals on which our country was founded and continues to aspire to achieve. January 6 was, to say the least, a brazen, violent, and deadly attack that traumatized this city, this community, and our country. And importantly, no one bore the brunt of this gutless attack more than the courageous law enforcement officers, including the men and women of the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, who went into the fire and violence with one objective in mind: remove the violent mob and restore our country's fragile democracy. While some desperately want to rewrite history and sweep the events of January 6 under the rug, the District of Columbia and its residents have chosen to speak truth through this filing, through this complaint, through this case. It is for these reasons that the independent Office of Attorney General for the District of Columbia is filing the first civil lawsuit by a state or municipal government to hold accountable the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and more than 30 of their leaders and members for conspiring to terrorize the District of Columbia, for unlawfully interfering with our country's peaceful transition of power, and for assaulting our men and women in blue who valiantly defended the Capitol, the district, and our freedoms. Specifically, we're bringing this lawsuit pursuant to local and federal laws, including the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, a Reconstruction-era federal law designed to protect our country against violent conspiracies, protect our citizens against violent conspiracies like the attack that took place on January 6. In the complaint, which has been filed and is public, we specifically allege that these vigilantes, insurrectionists, and masters of a lawless mob conspired against the District of Columbia, its law enforcement officers and residents by planning, promoting, and participating in the violent attack on the United States Capitol. We further allege the named defendants caused substantial and provable damage to the District of Columbia, and in particular to our courageous law enforcement officers who risked their lives, and some even died, to defend the Capitol, the District, and our country's freedoms. As the Independent Attorney General, I have the responsibility to enforce our laws and hold these violent defendants accountable because they cause actual physical and financial harm to our city, its employees, and our residents. So, we've brought this suit for 4 reasons. First, accountability. Holding wrongdoers accountable is an American value, and it's at the core of my legal responsibilities. The defendants, as you know, were not tourists, nor were they acting patriotically. They were vigilantes, members of a mob, insurrectionists who sought to crush our country's freedoms. Second, deterrence. Our country is a country of laws. We certainly can and do disagree on a plethora of issues, both big and small. However, in the United States of America and in the District of Columbia, we resolve our disagreements in a civil, non-violent manner. Those who don't play by these rules must be held responsible to deter future violent and undemocratic conduct. Restitution and recompense is the third reason why we're bringing this suit today. Because in our country, when an individual or entity suffers physical, mental, and financial injury caused by the illegal act of others, the victims are entitled to restitution and recompense. We all agree that the tragedy of pedestrians hit by a vehicle by walking on a crosswalk are deserving of restitution and recompense at the very least. So too are law enforcement officers who were injured in the course of stopping a violent mob hell-bent on taking away our freedoms. Again, restitution and recompense, those are American values. And in this case, the defendant's unlawful actions caused the district to deploy unprecedented resources to repel and defeat an attack on our country's capital. During the height of the attack, approximately 850 members of the Metropolitan Police Department were at the Capitol and the immediate area surrounding it. Scores of officers required emergency medical treatment and continue to receive physical and mental health treatment today as a result of physical injuries and trauma that in many cases will last a lifetime. These costs, including the unavailability of officers who are not able to immediately return to their jobs of protecting D.C. residents, are substantial. And we will, through this lawsuit, seek to impose severe financial penalties on the organizations and individuals responsible. Finally, we filed this suit to seek justice for the brave men and women of the Metropolitan Police Department. Police officers sign up to protect our residents. This is true. But they don't sign up for war on our country. They don't sign up to being attacked by an armed mob, beaten with bats, poles, and fists, dragged down stairs, kicked and stomped by thugs. My mind goes to Metropolitan Police Department Officer Michael Fanone, a veteran officer who himself voted for President Trump in 2016. Obviously, Michael Fanone defended the Capitol on January 6, and video evidence of Officer Fanone's testimony revealed that he fought valiantly against the mob. In doing so, he succumbed to the violent mob and was dragged down those Capitol steps. Officer Fanone suffered a heart attack and a concussion as he was repeatedly shot with a taser or shotgun and physically beaten. In Officer Fanone's own words, "Some guys started getting a hold of my gun and they were screaming out, 'Kill him, kill him,' with his own gun." A father of four, Officer Fanone pleaded for his life. Fortunately, but not before ending, physically hurt and mentally traumatized, Officer Fanone survived. Ladies and gentlemen, MPD Officer Gunther Hashida and Officer Kyle D. Freitag and a third MPD officer, Jeffrey Smith, also put their lives on the line on January 6th, and they suffered mightily. Sadly, they took their own lives afterwards. This lawsuit seeks justice for them, their families, and the many officers who still live with the pain from January 6th. Let me thank you for gathering here today. Now let me pass the mic to Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who has spent her life fighting for the equality that this country aspires for. She has spent her life fighting for the freedoms and democracy that the police officers fought for on January 6th. It is my honor to introduce you again to Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Attorney General Racine. I appreciate how you have laid out the purposes for this press conference, and I particularly appreciate the lawsuit that you so creatively are bringing. I am pleased to welcome to the Capitol our other guests, whom you will hear from shortly. On January 6th, the U.S. Capitol was attacked by individuals seeking to overturn our democratic form of government, while President Trump refused to send in the D.C. National Guard to the Capitol. The Metropolitan Police Department voluntarily responded, protecting the Capitol, Congress, and democracy itself. Despite the ongoing attack, Trump delayed in deploying the D.C. National Guard to defend the Capitol for hours. To ensure this would never happen again and to provide greater home rule and equality for the district, I was able to get included in the House-passed National Defense Authorization Act, my D.C. National Guard Home Rule Act, which would give the D.C. mayor control over the D.C. National Guard. I am very disappointed, however, that Republicans fought this provision and it was dropped from the final version of the National Defense Authorization Act. In their work defending the Capitol on that day, D.C. and the Metropolitan Police Department, in particular, of course, incurred expenses. I was able to secure a $9.1 million federal payment to the district in an emergency supplemental appropriations bill that was signed into law in July to compensate D.C. for the direct costs of responding to the attack. It is appropriate that the perpetrators of the attack compensate D.C. for the other costs DC incurred that day, including for medical treatment and paid leave, which are outside the scope of the funding I was able to secure for the district. From damage to police property to medical expenses related to the attack, the perpetrators, by the perpetrators, including Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, must pay the District of Columbia. I strongly support and appreciate the filing of this lawsuit.
Good morning. My name is Charles Allen. I'm the Ward 6 council member, and you're in Ward 6, so I represent the neighborhood around the Capitol. When I heard the Attorney General talking about September 11th, I couldn't help but look up at this blue sky and remember that day. And I think that January 6th will be as important in our nation's history as September 11th is. I'm here to say that I am in full support of Attorney General Racine's efforts to hold accountable those who carry out a premeditated, a coordinated attack, not only on our nation's capital, but on our home and on our MPD officers and on our residents. The impact of January 6th, it was felt nationwide, but few Americans, I think, experienced it as personally as we did. The insurrectionists intentionally created a situation that ultimately cost the lives and endangered many more. It's difficult to describe the terror that our residents, my constituents, felt during this insurrection. The pain, confusion that we collectively experienced as we saw a mob descending on our venerated institution and desecrating it. The concern we had for our neighbors who work in this building. I also have oversight for the first responders of the district. And I can tell you that our men and women in law enforcement and EMS, fire and EMS, they put their lives on the line today. And still today, they are suffering the emotional and physical harm that they experienced. I've talked with many officers. It was their first time even going inside that building, and they carry it with them, and the emotional and psychological harm and pain is something that they will be fighting and working on for the rest of their lives and careers. Today's suit is one way that we can demand accountability, and frankly, healing as both a community, a city, and a nation. I want to thank Attorney General Karl Racine and his team, all the partners that have been a part of this, for their work to seek justice for DC residents, as we are too often an afterthought, even when national affairs play out in our very own front yard. Last January, my two children were 8 and 4 years old, and we lived just a couple of blocks that direction. And recognizing that I have to tell them, and they will read about the history of what happened on January 6th. And my hope is that measures like this, actions that we take today, will also be part of that story that's told. As they get older, as generations come to understand what was at risk on January 6th, and the ways in which we came together to fight back, to preserve our democracy, and hold those who put it in jeopardy accountable. So thank you to the Attorney General, Karl Racine, and to everybody who's a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General Racine, Congresswoman Norton, Councilmember Allen, Jonathan Greenblatt, and the ADL team for bringing us together today. We're so grateful to have you as partners in this groundbreaking case. My name is Joanna Lidgate. I'm the CEO at the States United Democracy Center. We're a bipartisan team of former federal and state officials, law enforcement leaders, and security experts, and we help states protect our elections and our democracy. Before States United, I served as the Chief Deputy Attorney General for the state of Massachusetts, the top law enforcement office in the state. I got to work with colleagues across the country, including my good friend Karl Racine, to fight on behalf of everyday Americans and uphold the rule of law. A year ago today, on December 14th, 2020, presidential electors representing both parties met in all 50 states and the district to choose our next president. The electors did their jobs, and then they sent their choices to Congress to certify the will of the American people. On January 6th, 2021, the world watched in horror as a mob attacked the beautiful grounds we're standing on and the Capitol behind me. It wasn't just an attack on our members of Congress and our public safety officers. It was an attack on our democracy. It was an attack on the American people who made their voices heard in record numbers at the ballot box. Our government leaders were there on January 6th to affirm the will of the American voters. Our public safety officers were there to protect and serve. They were attacked for simply doing their jobs. That's why Republicans and Democrats alike condemned the violence and committed to preventing anything like it from happening again. And that's what this case is about. It's about holding the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and dozens of insurrectionists accountable for the violent assault on our democracy and the trauma they inflicted on the district and public safety officers that day. This case is about consequences, and it's about prevention. And while some would like to act like we can just move on from the horrors of January 6th, that would be irresponsible and dangerous. Right now, we're witnessing a major increase in political violence in America. Election lies and conspiracy theories helped fuel the insurrection, and those same lies pose a serious threat to our country today. Every day, because of those lies, our state and local election officials, the trusted guardians of our democracy, face violent threats and harassment. The attack on our democracy is far from over. And if we don't take action, we risk letting violence become a feature of our political life. We won't let that happen. We're a nation of laws, and there are serious consequences, legal and financial, for trying to hijack an election. History tells us that accountability is critical to moving forward. This case joins a powerful line of lawsuits holding perpetrators of political violence accountable. From the organizers of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville to the Aryan Nation and the Ku Klux Klan. Democracy isn't just an institution or a process. It's a living, breathing thing, a set of ongoing challenges. While the solution to all of those challenges certainly can't be found in the courtroom, the justice system has a pivotal role to play. This case is about justice for the district and for the brave officers who risked their lives on January 6th. Our capital and our country are still healing and processing, and too many families will never recover from the loss and trauma inflicted that day. We keep them in our hearts. Today, we also reaffirm our commitment to safeguarding the democratic system, the American foundation that those officers and those members of Congress were there to protect. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment. We are fighting for the future of our democracy. And we couldn't have better partners in that fight than the people standing with me here today, the amazing team of lawyers, the ADL, and leaders across this country like Attorney General Racine. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General Racine, Delegate Norton, Councilmember Allen, for having me here today, along with my colleague Joanna Lidgate from States United. ADL is the oldest anti-hate organization in the world, and we are truly honored to work with you on this landmark lawsuit on behalf of the District of Columbia against the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and more than 30 individuals who coordinated an act of domestic terrorism against our democracy right here in this place. We take this responsibility seriously. For more than 100 years, ADL has worked to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. To deliver on that mission, we have been at the forefront of strategically monitoring, exposing, and countering extremist threats from across the ideological spectrum. ADL's experts tracked the planning for the January 6th attack on the Capitol. We helped to identify the perpetrators and any connections that they had to groups like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. And we are deeply honored now to be putting that expertise at the service of the District of Columbia and the brave officers who were injured or killed on a result of that day. No one will forget the images we saw on January the 6th. And for the Jewish community, seeing individuals wearing anti-Semitic t-shirts with images like Camp Auschwitz on them while storming the Capitol building was particularly searing and traumatic. Make no mistake, January 6th was not a peaceful protest. Indeed, it was the most predictable terror attack in the history of our country. Countless law enforcement officers suffered physical injuries and lasting emotional trauma. 4 officers who responded that day have died by suicide. We are here fighting for justice for them, for the sanctity of our nation's capital, and for our democracy, because the violence perpetrated on that day, while unique in its severity and scope, was far from an isolated occurrence. It did not happen in a vacuum, and it did not end when the crowd dispersed. The attack on the Capitol took place against a political and cultural backdrop of hate and extremism that has proliferated and gone largely unchecked over the last 5 years. Extremism has been normalized. Hate has been amplified. This is about turning back that tide. And it is important because those who perpetrated the attack will not readily abandon their convictions. Domestic extremists like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and others continue to present a serious, credible, and dangerous threat to our democracy and to us all. We must respond with all of the tools at our disposal. We are all at risk if we fail to do so. Accountability for January the 6th is critically important to preventing another violent insurrection from happening in D.C. or in state capitals across the country. And that is why I am so proud and so humbled to be standing here today alongside this courageous and talented team. Thank you. And now I'll hand it back to Attorney General Racine.
Okay, we're prepared to take any questions that you might have.
General Racine, do these guys have any assets? Two parts. Do they have any assets that you could recoup? And then it's my understanding that this KKK Act has been used in the past to basically put extremist groups out of business, just bankrupt them. Is that your intent here?
Our intent, as we indicated, is to hold these violent mobsters and these violent hate groups accountable and to get every penny of damage that we can. Let me tell you, if it so happens that we bankrupt them, then that's a good day. When hate is dispatched and eliminated, that's a good day. And so, yes, we're using the Ku Klux Klan Act and other laws to absolutely bring as much financial pain, hit them in the pocket as possible. And sir, your question is excellent because the history will show that when these acts, like the Ku Klux Klan Act and other laws, were used against hate groups, what did they do? What did cowards do? They go running. They go hiding. They get decentralized, and frankly, they're less dangerous. When, as is the case today, as my colleagues noted, these groups are celebrated, told to stand back and stand by, what does that mean? That means that they are empowered. And so this is all about disempowering hate that would take your freedom away, my freedom away, and those of our children.
Mr. AG, the DC Superior Court.
Please, Congresswoman wants to speak.
I strongly agree with what the Attorney General Racine just said. We have no idea whether these people have any assets. I certainly hope they don't, as a matter of fact. But this lawsuit is important to have a deterrent effect. They're going to have to defend it. They're going to have to spend money defending it. So if we don't get a penny in restitution, this lawsuit's deterrent effect will say, be prepared to spend money to defend yourself because we are coming after you. Thank you, Mr. Attorney General.
That's actually related to my question for both you and the AG. A D.C. Superior Court judge issued a default judgment against the Proud Boys earlier this year for just ignoring a suit by the D.C. church that was vandalized in the Black Lives Matter sign. And also the Oath Keepers lawyer dropped them a month ago for failure to communicate and for not paying him. So what makes you confident that there will be restitution and recompense in this suit?
Well, as the Congresswoman said, whether there is in fact restitution or recompense, accountability is important. But through a case, as you know, and I sure hope they try to defend the case. Again, cowards, what they do, they pick on people, they bully, and when you punch back, they run away. But if they do defend this case, there's a process called civil discovery. And we can't wait to propound searing questions about the finances of these individuals and these groups. From where did the money come? Those are questions that we'll get at the root at in this lawsuit.
Related to the civil discovery, a lot of the evidence in my brief read of the complaint seems related to the federal investigation here and what federal prosecutors have found during the course of their investigation. Have you had any conversations with the U.S. Department of Justice about this lawsuit, and will there be sharing of any potential discovery that comes?
So I think at this point it wouldn't be appropriate for me to talk about conversations that may have occurred between the Office of Attorney General and this legal team and the Department of Justice. I do think it is important to emphasize that our case is a civil case. I think it's also important to emphasize that federal judges, let's be honest, you've reported this, federal judges have been deeply concerned at the extent of the penalties that have been assessed via certain plea agreements. I can guarantee you that as we proceed, we are going to seek the maximum level of financial penalty. Next question, please.
Sir, another criminal justice matter. D.C. has released its audit of the forensic crime lab. I know you've been an advocate for releasing that. I'm curious, do you believe any of your cases will be in jeopardy?
So the reporter is asking a question regarding local D.C. matters that are quite serious concerning our independent forensic lab. That's the lab that plays an important role in processing evidence and, of course, evidence that is submitted in a criminal trial where liberty is at stake. The allegations around the Department of Forensic Services have been going on for at least 15 months, and as you well stated, the Office of Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney's Office of the District of Columbia have clearly and repeatedly stated their grave concerns about the state of that agency. With this report,
Mr. Warnock, aye.
The yeas are 50, the nays are 49, and the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the joint resolution.
Counter number 184, SJ Res 33, joint resolution relating to increasing the debt limit.
Pursuant to the provisions of Public Law 117-71, there will now be 10 hours of debate on the joint resolution, equally divided between the chairman and the ranking member of the Committee on Finance.
Madam President,
The Majority Whip.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate stand in recess until 2:15 p.m. and that all time during recess count equally against both sides on the joint resolution.
Is there objection? Without objection.
For the information of senators, we expect a roll call vote on passage of Senate Joint Resolution 33 to occur at approximately 4 p.m. today.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands at recess until 2:15 p.m.